Hello, amazing psychology students, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 2, Sources of Information and Why Research is Best and How to Find It. So what we'll be covering in this chapter is the research versus your experience, the research versus your intuition, trusting authorities, finding and reading the research. So what are our learning objectives for this chapter is going to be to explain why all scientists, including psychologists, value research-based conclusions over beliefs based on experience, tuition, or authority, and locate legitimate research-based information and read it with a purpose. You will need to know how to do this because in the upcoming weeks, you guys will be responsible for doing a midterm paper as well as a final paper. So it does require research. It does require peer-reviewed journal articles and references and actually writing up a study. So let's get into it. So there are three sources of evidence for people's beliefs. They are experience, intuition, and authority. Okay. So in your guys' textbook, there's a section there that says the research versus your experience. So just so you guys know, experience has no comparison group. It's your own experience. There's really nothing to compare it to, right? So compared to what? Comparison groups enable us to compare what would happen both with and without the thing that we are interested in. So you might have seen something on TikTok where they had you tap your face and it was supposed to help calm you in an anxious moment. But does this technique really reduce anxiety? Our own experience and the experience of our friends and family are powerful sources of information. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of experience, right? So my Himalayan salt lamp cleans the air and enhances my well-being, okay? What is that compared to? You only have yourself to go off of. So it's literally just your experience. There is no comparison for that. I feel so much better after I vent my anger online. Shouldn't you trust your own experiences or those of people you know and trust as important sources of information? This is what we'll examine in this section. So there is a study done that's talked about in your guys' textbook that talks about radical mastectomies versus other treatments. So back in the days, doctors believed that you had to have a mastectomy and remove both breasts if you had cancer because they felt that that was the best form of treatment. So for decades, surgeons believed that was the most effective way to remove breast cancer, to the extent that they insulted anyone who suggested otherwise. As a result, alternative treatments were tested, and in 1971, yet they were found to be equally effective and far less destructive and reforming. So you guys will notice down below on the left is figure 2.3 from your textbook, and it looks at the long-term survival rate. Obviously, the green is radical mastectomies versus other treatments, and you'll see that according to here, from 1890 to the 70s, most surgeons simply assumed that radical mastectomies was the best treatment for breast cancer, but they only had data on their own procedures. Once again, no comparison group, right? And then in the middle column, you have the power of a comparison group. So you can actually see the comparison groups here. So if surgeons had collected data on both radical mastectomies and other treatments, they would have learned whether or not these treatments were worse, the same, or better than the surgery. And so finally, we move over to the last column, and it talks about the study's results. So they actually did a research and conducted a randomized clinical trial of 1,700 women. And they compared a group who had the radical mastectomy with women who had other treatments. And these other treatments included a simple mastectomy, possibly plus radiation. The results, the radical procedure did not lead to better outcomes. So today, radical mastectomies are almost never used. The figure shows the percentage of women who were still alive with no further cancer 25 years after treatment. So you can see here to the right, there's not much difference between the radical mastectomy versus other treatments and surgery condition and the survival rate. So they have now come to realize that they don't need to do that anymore to cure cancer for a woman that has breast cancer. All right. The research versus your experience. Experience is confounded, okay? In real-world situations, there are several possible explanations for an outcome. Alternative explanations in research are called confounds. The term confounded also means confused. A confound occurs when you think one thing caused an outcome, but in fact, other things changed too. So you are confused about what the cause really was. So you may be thinking it's one thing, but in reality, it could have been some other things that you weren't even thinking about. Those are called confounds. So you think that tapping on your face, right, made you feel calmer. But because you were also processing anxious thoughts, distracting yourself, and trying to feel better, you can't determine which of these facts or combinations of factors caused the actual improvement. So in research settings, scientists can use careful controls to be sure that they are changing only one factor at a time. So whenever you design an experiment, you have to make sure that you look for confounding factors that could influence the outcome of the behavior that you're manipulating. Okay. So research is better than experience. Here's one that's done. It's results from controlled research on the catharsis hypothesis. You guys can kind of read through that. It is in your guys' textbook. I'm not going to go over the slides too much, but I will tell you a tad bit about it. So you'll see off to the right there is subsequent aggression to a partner, and it looked at a study. And it was after Steve, the Confederate. So a Confederate is a person that's put into playing a role. Okay. After Steve was insulted, all the students in three groups were criticizing their essays. Okay. Those in group one sat quietly for 2 minutes. So you can see here, sits quietly, less than average. Those in group two hit a punching bag as exercise while thinking. Okay. And then those in group three hit a punching bag while imagining Steve's face on it, right? So Steve was insulting all of them and criticizing their essays. And these were the different ways that these groups were reacting to that. So later, students in all three groups had the chance to blast Steve with loud noise. The error bars, which are these things here, represent the standard error of the estimate. So you can see here that the z-scores all are conflicting with each other for different types of reasons. So Bushman conducted this study and he examined the effects of aggression of venting versus not venting. So obviously over here you're venting, punching the bag, versus sitting quietly, keeping everything inside, not venting, right? They used 600 students that were undergraduates, and the researcher needed to invoke anger in these participants. So he asked each undergraduate to write a political essay. And that's where the bantering came from, right? So Steve was placed in there. He was the Confederate. He was the actor playing the specific part for the experimenter. And he criticized these people's essays, saying they were the worst he had ever read and made other rude comments. Okay. So they were randomly assigned because in an experiment, you have to have random assignment. You can't put somebody in designated spots. They're randomly assigned, so everybody has the same chance to be in each type of group. So group one, we see here, they were told to sit quietly, right? Group two, right, is here and they get to punch the bag. And then finally, group three was told to punch the bag with and imagining Steve's face on it, right? So the participants played a quiz game with Steve, and they were given the opportunity to provide a blast of loud noise to Steve's ears. Which groups gave Steve the loudest long blasts? Group one showed less than average levels of aggression. Group two showed average, there's the line. And then group three showed greater than average levels of aggression. So the use of comparison groups and controlling for potential confounds in this study was used. So you could see if you taunted the aggression, subsequent aggression that came after, this is it. It's much higher than the normal average. Those that weren't allowed to be aggressive and sit quietly remain that way. So research results are what we call probabilistic. So behavioral research is probabilistic, which means that its findings are not expected to explain all the cases all of the time. There are exceptions to the rule. So the conclusions of research are meant to explain a certain proportion of possible cases, not every single one, okay? So scientific conclusions are based on patterns that emerge only when researchers set up comparison groups and test many people. If you're only testing one or two people, you're not going to get an accurate score. If you're looking on comparison groups. You need a good amount of people. You need many people, right? So research can suggest strong probabilities, okay? But the prediction is not 100% of the time. It's not perfect. You can't have 100%. There are exceptions. So just because research findings may show that the Kia Telluride is a reliable car, it doesn't mean that your Kia Telluride will be reliable too. Maybe you get a lemon, right? So occasionally you may hear about a research finding or an issue where your personal experience contradicts the results. What do you do in this case? Do you assume that the research is wrong? No. You may acknowledge that your experience might be an exception to what the research shows. Does an exception undermine the results? No, because in science, there are exceptions. Research versus your intuition, right? So our intuition is the gut feeling that we have about something, our hunch to things, okay? So we may believe our intuition is a good source of information, but it may lead us to make less effective decisions. So ways in which intuition is biased, there are 4 different ways. We're going to take a look at the first one, and that is being swayed by a good story, okay? So accepting a conclusion just because it makes sense or feels right? It feels natural to us. When empirical evidence contradicts what your common sense tells you, be ready to adjust your beliefs or the basis of your research. Automatically believing a story just because it makes sense can lead you astray. So let's just take a look at a common conspiracy theory that's out there. There are many people that believe that the moon landing was faked. It was done in a Hollywood studio, right? These are what these conspiracy theories think, okay? So here on the left, you have the conspiracy theorist. Look, the flag is waving. It had to be filmed on Earth. He's got circling things that supposedly show that it was filmed in a Hollywood studio. It doesn't make it true just because he's showing you that, right? So don't believe everything that feels true. And the conspiracy theory example we have is the moon landing was faked in a Hollywood studio. But we have empirical evidence, scientific-based evidence that proves otherwise, right? So we have NASA's photos that aren't doctored, okay, like the conspiracy theorist. We have actual moon rocks that are made of materials from the moon that are not found here on Earth. We have scientific measurements of the moon, and we have astronaut accounts all confirming the landing. Therefore, you can't be swayed by a good story. You got to look at all the evidence that is presented to you. Number 2, being persuaded by what comes easily to mind, right? So we have what we call the availability heuristic. And these are when things that pop up easily in our mind tend to guide our thinking, right? So causes of death, there's a chart to your right. These are the things that America's search history has Googled the most. And it suggests we are overly concerned about certain causes of death. So if you look here, there's heart disease, cancer is big. Cancer here is big on Google searches, right? Cause of death, most searched is definitely cancer. You can see here, okay? Media's coverage of all these different types of diseases. Cancer's right here. More media coverage. The New York Times is here. Obviously, cancer's a good percentage. We do have other things down below, but if you're looking at what's on everybody's mind, cancer seems to be the biggest because it is a cause of death and it is highly publicized in different news articles in different places, right? So heart disease and cancer kill similar numbers of Americans each year. But cancer is searched for on Google much more often, possibly because it is more reported on in the media and so is more prevalent in the public conscience, right? So ways that intuition can be biased. Number 3, focusing the evidence we expect. Okay, so there is such a thing as what we call confirmation bias, and it's the tendency to look at only the information that agrees with what we think, right? So you search for and look for information that goes with what you agree, and you tend to dismiss everything else that does not go with what you agree. That's confirmation bias. You are confirming your bias by pulling information that confirms your thinking. So we kind of cherry pick information and we take it in, right? Seeking and accepting only the evidence that supports what we already think. Psychological research has repeatedly found that when people are asked to test a hypothesis, they tend to seek only the evidence that supports their expectations and forget to ask questions that would disconfirm their initial view, right? So confirmation bias can and will happen if you are not aware of it. Okay. So here's our figure from the textbook on confirmation bias. This therapist suspects her client has an anxiety disorder. What kinds of questions should she be asking that would both potentially confirm and potentially disconfirm her hypothesis? So if she thinks this person has anxiety, she's probably going to ask the questions that may then lead her to come up with that diagnosis. But she also needs to ask the questions that could disconfirm that, because believe it or not, in psychology, there are several different types of disorders that can present as anxiety, but in reality, they may be symptoms of something else. And finally, number 4, being biased about being biased, right? Sometimes bias blind spot comes into play, and that's where we believe we're unable to fall prey to other biases previously described, or that we don't have any biases, right? That's not the case. All of us are biased at some point about something. But do you acknowledge that? And do you accept that? And then do you possibly try to change that, right? So most of us think we are less biased than others. So when we notice that our view of a situation is different from that of somebody else, we conclude that I'm the objective one here and you are the biased one, right? So here's an example for you guys from your textbook. Respondents in this study believed other Americans would say a person is smart and competent just because he or she is nice. However, they believe that they themselves did not have this bias. So here's a picture also from your textbook. It's figure 210, the bias blind spot. A physician who receives a free gift from a pharmaceutical salesperson might believe she wouldn't be biased by it, but she may also believe other physicians will be persuaded by such gifts to prescribe the drug company's medicines. So if you're a physician and you get all this cool gifts and stuff, you're more apt to remember them. You're more apt to remember what drugs that they are providing to you, and then you're more apt to possibly prescribe those types of drugs because you do remember what you got, right? So that could play into some form of bias. All right. The intuitive thinker versus the scientific reasoner. We make mistakes when we base our reasoning on intuition rather than empiricism. Researchers create comparison groups and look at all the data. By thinking scientifically instead of intuitively, we can eliminate or reduce our cognitive and motivational biases. We do this by reasoning systematically and empirically, as researchers do. So instead of only examining information that comes to mind easily or the parts that sound good, scientists look at all the data and try to be as objective as possible. So when you guys get into looking for things when it comes to scientific journals and scientific writing and producing your own research types of papers and reports and things like that, you really got to look at who are the people that are writing these papers? Who are the people that you're getting this information from? So trusting authorities, right? When celebrities make claims about the health benefits of crystals, herbal supplements, or particular diets, should you believe them? Should you buy products based only on these celebrity endorsements, right? Do you trust what authorities tell you to believe? You would want to consider the authorities' background and credentials before deciding how reliable they are. You would also want to consider where that authority obtained the information. Is it based on personal experience or intuition, or is it based on scientific evidence? So say, for example, you have someone that is giving you a health plan, right? They're giving you a routine of workouts to do to get fit. They're providing meal plans for you. But it's somebody possibly like Gwyneth Paltrow who doesn't really work out, doesn't really go to the gym. Maybe she's on a special diet, but what does she really truly know about all of that stuff? Versus you meet someone that has a certificate or a license as a personal trainer, as a nutrition coach, possibly as a bodybuilder. Obviously, they have experience, they have expertise in their field. Maybe the person you're talking to is a competitive bodybuilder, so they've done competitions in place before. That shows that they are an expert in their field with things like that that you might be interested in and possibly be willing to try, right? So sources of information is a cool little chart here. It's a concept map showing sources of information and how it works. So you'll notice that The ways of knowing that appear in the boxes outlined in black are the most trustworthy. So you can go through and kind of look at that and see that the black is outlined here. It's based on research, scientific sources in psychology, so journal research articles, full-length books, empirical articles, review articles, all of those are considered to be sources of information and creditable and trustworthy versus some of the other ones that are here. But you can take a look at this. This is also in your guys' textbook. So when we're finding and reading the research, in order to base your beliefs on empirical evidence, you will need to know how to find and read the scientific research. Throughout this course, you will need to be able to do this. So it's important that you guys know what to look for and which types of sources you can actually use. So consulting scientific sources, you have to find legitimate science sources. You have to read the research, and you have to have legitimate journalism and know the difference between that versus disinformation. So there are three places where psychological scientists typically publish their research: journal articles, chapters in edited books, and full-length books. And I'm going to tell you for this course, most of you are going to want to use journal articles. So journal articles are psychology's most important source. Okay, they are printed online. There are websites that have databases on them. The school provides databases for you guys to look at journal articles to help you in school with whatever classes you may be taking. So journals are usually published monthly or quarterly. However, scientific journals look different from popular magazines. They don't include advertisements. They're probably not very colorful, but rather written for an audience of other psychological scientists and students of psychology. So we kind of touched upon that last chapter. Journal articles are peer-reviewed. You can find journal articles in college and university libraries, or by using online academic databases, which you guys do have access to in the Canvas. There's a link off to the left in your navigation for a library website, and you can click on that, and it will take you to some of the databases that you guys can use to access articles, journal articles. So there are two different types of journal articles. We have what we call empirical journal articles, and we have review journal articles. So empirical journal articles report the method and results for research studies that are being reported for the first time. Review journal articles summarized all the published studies that have been conducted in that particular research area. So review articles can be a narrative reviews of the literature that qualitatively summarize the research, or they may use a quantitative approach called a meta-analysis to combine the results of many studies statistically. You also have chapters and edited books that you guys can look at, as well as full-length books, and you can read a little bit more about that in your guys' textbook. Finding legitimate science sources, like I said, there is a link in our classroom navigation on the left titled Library Website. This will take you to the EBSCO database, and you can search for journal articles there. So there are different places that you can also search. You can use PsycInfo, which is where you're going to access through EBSCO in the library website for the college. It has most of the articles in there are peer-reviewed, so they are totally perfect to use for your guys' upcoming assignments. You can use Google Scholar. So it doesn't have access to PsycInfo database, but you can use the free tool Google Scholar. It works like regular Google search, but it just searches results that are only in the form of empirical journal articles and scholarly books. Okay. So note that not all journals are reliable. Some are predatory and will publish anything that is submitted. So you really got to look into that and see when you're reading journal articles, has this article been referenced before? Where did they get this information from, right? So some articles are what we call paywalled. They require a subscription to access. You shouldn't need to do that, okay? You guys have open access and available for free journals if you guys use the college's website or Google Scholar, because as college students, that's provided to you. So there is a table I've included that's also in your guys' textbook, and it's tips for turning your questions into a successful database search. You might want to check that out. Reading the research. You guys, for this week's assignment for Chapter 2, have to look at a peer-reviewed article and summarize it, okay? So it's important that you go over all the parts of the article. And so all of those parts are listed over here on the left. So you will notice that most of your journal articles are all set up the same way. They all have the same things in them, and that's the information that you're going to look for. So they should have an abstract, right? It's the summary of the article. They should have the introduction, so it explains the topic, the methods, what the researchers did to conduct the study, the results, what did they come up with? It describes what tests, what were the results of the study. Discussion summarizes the study and the significant contributions. And finally, references. Okay. So reading with a purpose. Now that you've found your article or book, you need to know how to read it with a purpose. So you want to look at empirical journal articles. You don't need to read every word of the article. Ask yourself the questions. What is the argument? What is the evidence? That's basically what you need to get from it, right? So empirical journals are written in APA format, and most are structured the same way. So they got the abstract, the info, the methods, the research results, the discussion, and the references. Same thing with chapters and review articles. If you're looking at those, you still want to ask the same types of questions to yourself. What is the argument? And what is the evidence? Okay. Legitimate journalism versus disinformation is a big one, right? So here's this sensational report that came out on TV, and it says, are teens growing head horns? How cell phone overuse may be changing our bodies. So 18 to 30-year-olds, these are the statistics that they came up with. They did 1,200 skull x-rays, and they found that 33% had horn-like growths. Okay, those are kind of shocking accusations made on this scientific report, supposedly. So the news has sensationalized it. It was a news report. It was based on a single research study that was later widely criticized by other researchers and journalists. Although the news report prominently displayed some of the numerical values from the study's method was not adequate to determine that cell phone use was actually changing our bodies. So the popular press, magazines, newspapers, TV news, radio news shows, web-based magazines, and blogs designed for a popular audience, so they don't always accurately reflect the scholarly research. Okay, so disinformation happens. Disinformation is the deliberate creation and sharing of information known to be false, guys. So people spread disinformation for several reasons and of several different types. Some is completely false, while some is more subtle. So I did include in your table here, which is also in your guys' textbook, scholarly and popular articles about research that serve different goals and audiences. So you can see all the different types that are there. You can reference that chart. Moving on to avoiding disinformation. We already know what it is. Disinformation is the deliberate creation and sharing of information known to be false. People think of this as conspiracy theories, right? You'll see this used with false quotes that supposedly were accounted for by real people, right? So I've seen quotes done, and then at the end, they'll be like Abraham Lincoln. And I know for a fact, studying history, Abraham Lincoln never said any of that, right? Or it could be a real quote that's taken completely out of context. You see that happen a lot with your political, when it's time for voting to happen and things like that, your political candidates, right? They take real quotes out of context. So disinformation-based conspiracy theories motivated several actors in the insurrection of January 6, 2021, which killed 5 people and threatened U.S. democracy's peaceful transfer of power. So what are motives for disinformation? Why does that happen? So emotional lies can drive votes and enhance political support. Provocation motivates people who want to punk others into emotional reactions. Profit is a motive too. False scientific claims about different items may accompany a shopping website. There is also a chance that the motive is a parody, and that's sites like The Onion, which create false stories only to make us laugh. They're parodies, right? Like movies, parodies of movies. The infographic that you guys see here is be information literate, not gullible or cynical, and it takes you through and goes over some important things for you. So if a social media share makes you feel fearful, angry, or vindicated, track down the source. What's the context? Is the source neutral or biased? Is it a hoax? Right? So you got to look at all that kind of stuff. And this chart here, this infographic does a real good job of that. So yeah, it presents ways to verify stories you might be tempted to believe. Okay. And finally, I don't want you guys to forget to make sure that you answer this week's discussion question. It is, how do we know what to believe? So in order for you to answer all parts of this week's discussion question, it's imperative that you read the chapter first. It'll apply intuition, it applies disinformation in there, or just go back through the slides and that should pretty much help you. Other than that, that pretty much sums up our chapter 2 for you guys this week. Remember, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email and discuss those with you, and I can help you. I can also give you Zoom tutoring by appointment. That's completely up to you guys. But you guys all have a great week, and I will see you next week.